Bill, we have questions as it relates to the history of the Bible, where the Bible came from, and obviously it's a book that was written over a fairly long period of time. And in popular Christian imagination, I think sometimes there's sort of this perception, we joke about how it's just the Bible fell out of heaven and into our laps and all 66 books. So could you help us maybe think through the history of how the text actually became what we now hold in our copies of the English Bible today?
Yeah, the Old Testament story and the New Testament story is quite a bit different at that point. In the Old Testament, you have lots of different writers and the slow process of it coming together and to be accepted. And we generally don't think that the Old Testament canon, the official collection of books, was actually set even in the time of Christ. In fact, it's generally dated at the end of the first century that the Jews, because of what the Christians were doing, they needed to say, well, no, these are the books that we want. And so that's in the story in the Old Testament is pretty consistent. There's not a lot of question, at least in the Hebrew canon, as to what books belong in there. There's much more variety, though, of course, when you get to issues of Apocrypha and issues of the New Testament canon. And in terms of the Old Testament Apocrypha, that's the main reason why the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible are of different length. And you've got these, 12, 13 books that are in the Catholic Bible that aren't in the Protestant Bible. And these were all books that were not written in Hebrew, and they were written after Malachi. And the Jews always understood that they were just a little different, and they weren't quite sure what to do with them. And the problem for us is that they were in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so the Bible that Paul probably carried with him had, Bel and the Dragon, and in these books. And the history of what we call the Old Testament Apocrypha, I think, is really fascinating, because the church always knew that they were around and being used, but there was something secondary in quality about them. And so you find statements in church history about, well, read them, but don't base any theology on them. And Jerome didn't want to include them in the Vulgate, but ended up having to. And it really wasn't until the Reformation that those books came under question. And Luther didn't like them primarily. Well, they weren't in Hebrew, and that was a big no for him. But he also didn't like how the church drew some of their doctrine of indulgences out of some of these books. And so Luther did a really smart thing. Up until that time, these books had been interspersed throughout the Old Testament canon, and so they it all looked like one big corpus. And what Luther did is he pulled those books out and he published them between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then that's how he left it. And then within about 100 years, publishers adopted out all together. And it wasn't until the Council of Trent, about 100 years later, that the Catholic Church finally said officially, hey, these books belong in the canon. So it's not like the church officially decided in Paul's day that all these books should be there. But it's a real interesting process, some political, some theological. But that's so the Catholics keep those books. That's why they have more books in their Old Testament than we do. And that's how they got dropped out in New Testament. I mean in the Protestant church. And I think if you just read these, and again, I'm a Protestant, but I think if you just read these, you can tell they're different. I mean, some good stuff, some crazy stuff. Of course, there's good and crazy stuff in our canon too, right? Yeah. But you can tell that there's something different. But what I tell people is that they were not written in Hebrew. They were written after Malachi, after the Spirit of the Lord stopped speaking, Judaism said. They were never accepted by the Jews. And it is, in a sense, their canon, and they should be able to decide it. So that's why there's difference there.